aspects of what is on. Let's switch to the applied side a little bit and then application side rather than on a theoretical aspects. And I come from an institute, Indian National Center for Ocean Information Services. This institute gives operational ocean state forecasts regularly, and we use a model called ROMS, Regional Ocean Modeling System. So the larger aim is to include data assimilation in ROMS, but this being a very large system, so we thought that we will start first with a kind of a toy model. This linear reduced gravity model is more of a toy model that essentially captures the ocean in a coarse way. So it doesn't capture all the finer details, but on a coarse way it does capture few of the qualitative details of the oceans. So this is what the model is all about. So this is called 1.5 layer reduced gravity model. So these these are basically shallow water equations which are linearized. This gives outputs as 3 variables, the 2 currents in the 2 directions, zonal and meridional, and the sea surface height, the sea surface anomaly. Now this is 1.5 layer because this consists of just 2 layers. This is a very simplified model. 2 layers, the bottom layer is taken to be kind of infinitely deep and static, whereas the upper layer is only active. And this does not resolve all the modes of the ocean. It has only 2 modes. One is the surface gravity waves and the other is the internal gravity waves. That's the interface between the 2 layers having 2 different densities. The upper one has a lighter density because of that stability, and the lower one has a higher density. So our plan is to assimilate sea surface. Before that, so this is the domain that we have worked on. So this is for the entire Indian Ocean. If someone may not know, but I guess everybody knows, but still I will specify. So this part of the ocean is called Bay of Bengal. This part is called the Arabian Sea, and the rest is the kind of Indian Ocean. So as I said, there are just 2 vertical levels, and the horizontal resolution is very coarse. It's just ½ degree. That means it's around 50-60 kilometers. We force the model with winds taken from NCEP. And I forgot to mention, normally in ocean state forecast, you say you give forecast for the 2 currents, sea level anomaly, temperature and salinity. But in this model, we are not including temperature and salinity for simplicity. Just the 2 currents and this sea surface height anomaly. Okay. And this model is closed. Normally, what happens in real situation is that the Indian Ocean interacts with the Pacific Ocean through this channel. But to keep matters simple, we have also closed this. So this is more of just a qualitative study of things. Which observations to assimilate? So we have taken sea surface height anomaly observed by satellites, which has around an accuracy of ±4 centimeters. And these errors are due to mainly due to 3 reasons. One is instrument noise, and there are satellite tracking errors, and you don't know the geoid completely. So some errors come from this geoid approximation of the Earth. So taken together, so the minimum accuracy is about ±4 centimeter.
What's the difference between precision and
Statistics people, is there anyone?
We have a very precise
Yeah.
thermometer that was 10
So,
degrees too high.
right,
Oh, I see.
right.
Come again?
We have a very precise in its measurement
Yeah.
thermometer that measures everything 10 degrees too high.
Yeah. So that is precision, right. So, fine. So this is how the model performs before we assimilate anything. So just if you run the model, this is the plot of sea level anomaly in the Arabian Sea region. So the red one is the model and the black is the observation. The model being coarse, you can see that you do not resolve all the variabilities. Also linear, yeah, both linear and coarse.
And also, is this at one location or is this average over?
This is averaged over a certain region, a small region in the Arabian Sea. But the model is not very bad. At least it gets the annual features right, the annual variabilities in the Arabian Sea. And then, what? No, no, this is a model for sea level anomaly. This is a plot for sea, yeah.
The 3 PDs that you solve
Yeah.
the equation, then it goes
Yeah.
on. These observations are different from the one that was related against.
No, this is the same observations. Same observations. Yeah. So and this is without assimilation. I haven't yet assimilated. So this is how the free model behaves. Okay. No assimilation as of yet. I'm just saying how good the free model itself is.
It gets a post period.
Right. Right. This is in Bay of Bengal. Things are worse in Bay of Bengal because there are issues like lots of eddies normally form in Bay of Bengal, which this coarse model cannot resolve. So there are many kinds of issues, and normally oceanographic people working in Indian Ocean don't expect a good result as of now in current scenario in Bay of Bengal. So this is not very unexpected.
Well, the model has some parameters to include in it, so that's the best parameter to get.
Yes. But it was a small project done by one of our colleagues. So we didn't extensively tune all the parameters in C. So
You took all the grid points.
yes.
I mean, C and you average it out.
Not all the grid points, but some grid points and then averaged it. Not all the grid points. This is in the equatorial Indian Ocean, and things are pretty good in the equatorial Indian Ocean. Most of the models that we know of perform good in the equatorial Indian Ocean. Now, okay, so our plan is to use ensemble Kalman filter to assimilate this model states.
On the real data, is there a strong correlation? Like for example, there's a high peak here.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay, so this high peak is due to, in 1997, there was a strong El Nino.
And it happens in all the other data as well, or it's just
No, no, no. So it's not there in other, because
it's very good model. And I mean, I guess the fact that you pick up the peak so well is because of the force. So
because of the forcing.
So you still have the right forcing there.
Yes.
Okay.
So we are,
Forcing will give it right.
so the forcing is only winds. So as a forcing, we have only winds. So, and that is from NCEP.
Data, right? I mean, when you say
Real data, yeah.
real data.
Real data.
So when you say free model run, I was thinking
No, 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 no. Free model in the sense that there is no assimilation.
the forced model,
Yeah.
real data.
Right. So our idea is to assimilate it using ensemble Kalman filter. This model is typically of dimension 10 to the power 4. Yeah. Parameter for longitude latitude means? this model, you have some differential equations, like I showed. What you do is that if this is the domain you want to work on, you divide that domain into grids. So which are your basically discretized x and y, or latitudes and longitude. Did I answer?
So the thing is, we had not considered this Stallwater model on a rotating sphere, right?
No, there is because of this term. So beta is del f del y. F is the Coriolis parameter. So this
Coriolis force then would consist of all these things, right?
yeah, definitely. So this is the forcing term that comes from the winds. Yes, so our idea is to do it through ensemble Kalman filter, because that's what we want to use in these ROMs. So kind of develop the skill in ensemble Kalman filter. So in ensemble, the first step, I guess, is to generate the initial ensemble. So this is how we generated it. We have let the model run for around 200 years. And then for each of the years, we have the model states, we have written it down as a column of the matrix. So you have 200 such columns. Okay. And we have generated a matrix A. We did an SVD analysis of that A. And we got around 200 eigenvalues and associated eigenvectors. So what we are seeing is that these eigenvalues, they fall very rapidly. And after 20 or something, they are quite less, below 1 or so. So we decided that we will take just 20 eigenvalues, take the associated 20 eigenvectors, and perturb the mean state of the ocean with these 20 eigenvectors to generate 20 ensemble members. Okay. But the question is, we still do not know whether 20 member is enough, and the observational covariance that typically comes in an Kalman filter algorithm, we have approximated it with a diagonal matrix with these typical errors that comes in. Okay, so sorry, this should be 16, 4 square. Yeah, the variance. Yes. So, so my question to this forum is to people who have already experience in ensemble Kalman filters, whether this is kind of the right way to generate the initial ensemble. This is what we have done, but whether this is the right way to do it or reasonably good way to do it. I guess there are many ways to generate. So, yeah.
I understand that by doing so, you are n numbers which are consistent or reasonable consistent with the system properties. But if you do not want that, what you want is that the ensemble covariance, as soon as it's used, diagonal diverge and push you in a way or in another toward the observation. Maybe at the beginning it's not so good, but after a certain time, if everything goes reasonably well, your ensemble is a good approximation of the error at that moment.
But I will show you results. I will show you results of this, and what happens is that these ensemble members, as we proceed, they kind of collapse. Even after that.
That's another point. That's another point.
Yeah.
That's another point. But I mean, I don't understand why you're. So the business that you're doing here is too much for the purposes. What I will do is simply random perturbing,
And-
doing an optimal interpolation for a sufficient time, and then using the ensemble into your analysis.
But
The motivation is you just literally add random numbers.
but in
You generate random numbers and
Why a random number generated by using the R matrix as a sample for it. For instance,
But how do you ensure, in that case, how do you ensure that these model member, these ensemble members, they don't collapse? Do you have anything?
Collapse is another problem. The problem of collapse is not something that you are solving by doing so. That's what I'm saying. So the question is how to initialize ensemble is finding a reduced number of members which are consistent with the system state and a good representation of the real error at the moment. That's what we want.
Yeah,
The
so
problem of maintaining this ensemble alive is another issue. That's why I mean
no, but isn't there kind of just intuitively thinking that if I do it in a random manner, then there is more possibility of collapsing rather than doing it this way?
I wouldn't say that. The collapse is due to the stability of the system, to the frequency of observation, the size of the observational error, and the way how you work out the observations. Because I guess the ensemble cannot fit in which each member simulates a different observation, right?
In this case, no. It should actually what happened is that this was done hurriedly. He had to submit his project, so it was done for a single observation only.
So that's the reason why it's collapsing as well. Because
Maybe,
it became
maybe,
the
yeah,
observation
maybe.
in the limit of the observational error in the observational point. And then if you observe the diffuse phase, this is already something that makes it
Can I
collapse.
make a comment?
Yeah.
See, in your eigenvalue selection, you just took the model,
Right,
right?
right.
You don't even know the data. This
Yes,
is complete from the model.
completely from the model.
Okay.
Right,
So what we have picked up are the modes that are sensitive to your input from your force.
right, right.
But there are these modes may not be sensitive for your observations. See, the observations, so this is the problem. You are taking the modes
Mhm.
which are sensitive to your input tau x,
Right.
tau y.
Right, right.
This is called a POV, proportional decomposition. But observations are different modes. The different modes may be sensitive to observations.
Mm.
So they may not match.
Yeah.
To find is called balancing. It's a very the concept of control theory. It's called balancing. We have to find the modes which are sensitive for the input as well as for the observation.
Okay, so
And that intersection, those modes will be the one you should try. This is my first comment.
okay, so that will generate a better ensemble.
And a better example, which will be smaller than those, and they will not collapse fast.
Mm.
You just should have just your model, but the input from the observation doesn't have any effect on this model. It may be the
Yes.
mode that you have selected.
The modes that we have selected does not respond to the observation.
The observation.
That's what you're saying. Okay.
So if you combine them together, and that there is a theory called balancing. Electrical engineers, I think.
I think there's, I don't know, there's a conceptual issue which is based in control is where should you do the approximation?
Balance.
And the general message is you should do the approximation from an input-output viewpoint
Correct.
and not in the direction of state.
That's exactly balancing, all right?
Because you have two,
Balance truncation. Yes.
because you can have two input-output maps which are very near each other,
Mm.
but whose corresponding state space dimensions may vary widely. But now the thing is, I mean, this conceptual comment is, I think you've got to ask the question that, you know, what are you doing this modeling and approximation for? You know, if you want to control something, you may be able to do it at a very crude level, or if you want to do filtering and so on, maybe you can get it very much closer.
But then he has two things. One is a forcing that is entering through tau x, tau y. That's like the control U. Other one is the observation y. So the input output is the right map. That's exactly what balance truncation does. It finds eigenvalues for both.
Well, it's a particular way of doing uncontrolled process.
Exactly. That's exactly balance truncation is. Until normal form.
Okay.
There is no control as such. Input.
No.
Yeah, input. The forcing. The forcing is the places where it's not a control. No, it's not control, but what's in input? Control and input.
I'm a little bit behind on the actual question. So
Right.
Before you start assembling.
Before you start.
But isn't this a modeling issue? I mean, this is a question of what is my, so, it's not about the algorithm, like you're talking about, oh, I want to pick my initial ensemble to avoid collapse. But the initial ensemble has a physical meaning, right? This should represent the uncertainty in my initial estimate. So
Right.
how you represent that is a modeling issue, and I don't know, so people in data simulation have, have ideas about this, but it should be a physical issue. It should not be
You see, that's why
have anything to do with your algorithm.
that's why we generated the initial ensemble from the model itself.
This is actually well done and makes sense. My only comment in this respect is that the business is not required because you can do something, or once you did it, okay, you did it.
Your point is you can do something simpler and still have something
Simpler
usable.
and something everyday, still having an ensemble which is maybe a good enough representation of the actual error, but as soon as you start doing a simulation, if the algorithm, if the ensemble do not collapse, then the ensemble adjusts itself. But what they are doing is practically meaningful because it's based on the property of the model alone.
It's a linear model.
Which is the only prior information you have.
Which is the only part information you have.
But then the question is, in some sense, what is the, so you're asking a question, we're doing it this way, is this the right way to do it? But one of the first questions is, why would it, what don't you like about the way you're doing it?
The results. The results. After doing this, I'm going through, it's collapsing.
It's collapsing. Maybe I should say not what you're, right? I mean, so the initial ensemble should be a physical thing, right?
When he assimilates
If
the
you don't like
data,
the results, then it's not the initial ensemble you should be worried about, right?
when he assimilates the data,
Yeah.
it's on 20, the reason actually the modes that he picked are not sensitive to those Ys.
But the solution is not to pick a different ensemble, the solution is to use a different assimilation.
So that was a use part of filters.
He ignored the modes.
And the counter-example is that if you use the same procedure without property conservation, and you have the right error at the beginning, so you make an ensemble which projects on the right error, you will have collapsing anyway. So this is I'm sure that if you can do this experiment, you will learn that. This is a proof of the fact that it's not the way how you utilize an ensemble to cure the problem. The cure the problem is the fact that you are doing all ensemble members equal or approximately equal to the observation at each analysis count. So the collapse occurs at analysis moment, not during the forecast. So it doesn't really matter to start. Even if you
No, there is a bit of a difference in this case. It's actually a linear model. So the members don't really diverge much because it's a linear model, it's not chaotic.
There are no regime changes, nothing.
linear, but anyway it can be
But they don't diverge much. If you start, whatever variance you start with, the variance doesn't change much.
okay, but anyway, they still do not
Yeah,
collapse.
they have to spectrum. They do not
The
collapse.
name is called Henkel spectrum for the input-output trap. That's what the balance modes are. Lots of literature can be written.
You wrote it down? Yeah, Henkel spectrum. Fine. Okay, so this is how we generated the initial ensemble. We have taken just 20. It may not be enough, and it is not enough, I guess. This is the results that we are looking into. So this is the RMS error of the model without any assimilation. This is the RMS error of the model after assimilation. So what we are seeing is that there is a reduction, and this is the difference between these stages. Kalman filter,
What period?
this is, we have assimilated only for 1 year. And the data is weekly data. It comes once in a week. 50, 52, 53 kind of assimilated steps. Kalman filter being a minimum variance stuff, so we looked at the variance as well, and we see that the variance thus gets reduced with time. So we looked that assimilating this sea surface anomaly, whether there is any, this is the total variance. That's the trace of the covariance matrix.
This is the estimated variance.
Yes. Okay, so this is the time series of this for this 1 year of this sea level anomaly. this is the black one is for the model without any assimilation. The green is for assimilated and the red is for the observation. So what we're seeing is that particularly initially, during the initial days, there are some improvements due to assimilation. That is, at least it's trying to go towards the observations. But later on, after let's say 3-4 months, this kind of this assimilated and this free run, they just collapse onto one. Next we try to see whether assimilating sea surface anomaly data triggers any improvements in currents or not. This is a closer inspection of this. What we're seeing is that the same notation, this black is the free model run, this red is the observation, and this green is after assimilation. So we're seeing that there are many regions where the assimilation process is successfully trying to take the model currents towards the observations. But that is true only during the initial phases.
These observations are not assimilated.
These observations are not assimilated. This is just current data, Oscar current data. So,
For the 1 year you estimate data.
what?
For the first year you estimate the data, right?
Yes, so during the first year. So we started with January. This is the result of February after 1 month, after 2-3 assimilation steps. The green lines is the analysis. The red one is the observation. I am not assimilating currents. I am not assimilating any current data. I am assimilating only sea level anomaly data. So, yeah. So this is what happens with the spread of the ensemble. So when I start with, the spread was, there was some considerable spread, but as I go in time, you see they kind of collapse into each other. Yeah.
The variance that you showed before,
Yeah,
you told me that it's the trace of the covariance matrix.
right.
So it's the spread. It's the square of the spread in a way.
Yes, kind of, right.
So what we really want is not to look at that. What we want is to look at the variance of the real error or the estimate of that. So what we really want is that the spread of the trace of the cellular covariance may always larger than the actual error. So that's what we need. So if you
Yes.
look at the project you showed before, it's not an indication of the fact that the fitting is working properly. And the opposite is the proof of the fact that the ensemble or the members are collapsed.
So, okay.
You can already look it from there, because it is the trace of the other, because that's why I asked you if it is the variance of the error or of the variance estimated by the ensemble.
So this is calculated by taking the analysis ensemble, getting the covariance of the analysis, and taking the trace of that covariance matrix.
Basically, a spread of the ensemble.
So it's the error with respect to the observation. So it's not the real error, it's the one that is estimated using the ensemble. So if it is 0, it means that
They have
the
collapsed.
ensemble are all equal to so they are not the values.
So
So this is already an indication of the fact that it's collapsing. Now, the point is that if the real error is collapsed as well, it's not a problem. Please. Sorry.
okay. Yeah. So this is where it ends. Yeah. Why does it jump?
It's not dying.
No. This is just sea level anomaly. So sea level anomaly has a variation like that only. So this is a sea level anomaly of the ensemble members of 5 or 10 ensemble members that we have plotted. So we started with spread in the sea level anomaly of the ensemble members, but what we're seeing as we go ahead in time, they reduce into the kind of collapse into one. Yeah. what we have seen is that there is some improvement in the RMS error of SLA, particularly during the initial days. The best improvement is in the equatorial Indian Ocean because first the model does well, and also the Rossby radius of deformation in the equatorial belt is large, so that this low resolution works well there. This is for the model. The improvements are short-lived. So our analysis was kind of this, why it is short-lived. The observations are weekly assimilated, once in a week. That is, we felt is kind of too sparse in time, because the model has only one or two baroclinic modes, one or two modes which are quite fast, unlike real oceans which has a large memory. This one being fast, so whatever adjustment you do in the analysis step, that is quickly propagated and the ocean forgets. This is what we are thinking. Maybe this is one of the reasons for the ensemble collapse. Our guess why it collapsed is one of the reasons is that the virtual observations were not generated and not assimilated for each of the ensemble members. All the ensemble members were taking just one observation. So that shouldn't be the case. And another case may be that 20 ensemble members may not be enough. So we may just need to check that by increasing the ensemble members and seeing whether there is any significant improvement. And that's it. So,
Your model is completely deterministic, right?
yeah, my model is completely deterministic.
Tau x is
Yeah,
Galaxy just forcing.
it's just forcing. Yeah, there is no stochasticity.
Forcing is the same for every member.
Yes.
The first that you lose spread is at the surface. When you give it the forcing, you are losing spread already there. That's for sure. But the check that I will do is simple to trace the trace of the PA matrix and the trace of the PF matrix in comparison to Schubert time as a function of time.
Okay.
To give you an idea, if the collapse occur more often during the forecast step, due to the stable, if the system is stable or whatever, or to the analysis step. Given the system is linear, you know already if it is damping or not. If it is not damping, as I guess, most of the collapse occur at analysis time. So you will see that the trace of the PF is systematically larger than the trace
Trace of the PA.
And if it is the case, you need to do something at analysis time. And what people do usually do not, is that some of common filter as it is implemented in practice, you generate an ensemble of observation from the same hub, and this maintains the system alive. This is what people do.
So this is what virtual observations are, right? Generating virtual observations. And
Very logical
yeah.
further step to do. I will just make a check about the true matrix PA.
so another thing you just mentioned is that these all the ensemble members are forced with the same wind. So yeah. So what do they do?
Boundary condition in a way. So when you use a model which is local, people perturb at the same time, because you are initializing, perturb all the boundary conditions. And in your case, also forcing. So you
Perturb just randomly?
just randomly again, unless the forcing database that you are using is already provided you a set of ensembles, which is quite common right now. The local analysis data set, they also have an ensemble. But I don't know about the forcing that you are using.
But how do you get a hold on the strength of the perturbations? Like just trial and error, or is there any?
The amplitude of the perturbation for
Right, right.
it's not real. We can think about it, but and I don't like personally the fact that it's clear that the forcing is the same. They are losing spread at that moment. That's clear. But if you leave your forcing, you better want to use it as it is. So it's a matter of compromise. You want your ensemble to be alive, otherwise it's
Okay, so this is where it ends. Flip.
I think
In data assimilation papers, it seems that people are interested in models just dynamical systems, right, without any noise. They're chaotic dynamical systems that has no noise. You have observation noise, of course, and then then you have a random initial condition, and then you try to do filtering. But if you look in the filtering literature, there's always, I mean, models with no noise, right, deterministic models are never studied in the filtering literature, and there's a very good reason for that, right? So let's say that we have it, and I'll do it in discrete time, but you can do this in continuous time might be better. It doesn't really matter, right? So let's take a model. Xn is just a function of xn minus 1. And you might take some random initial condition, right? So this is a model that in data assimilation shows up a lot. Take it in one dimension, right? And of course, in principle, this is a Markov chain, right? It's a Markov chain where the transition kernel is just a point mass at each time, right? So you can apply everything, right? You can run a particle filter on this, but if you run a particle filter on this, I guarantee you it's not going to work very well. You're going to see this collapse happening that we saw in the last talk. And Elaine said something similar, I think, yesterday for, I don't remember what method you were using, but you were seeing that when you use a deterministic system, over time, it gets worse and worse and worse, right? So there is a reason. The reason for this is very, very easy to understand from the point of view of filtering theory. Right? Remember, I told you yesterday that if you want the filter to work well, any approximation, not just a particle filter, but any approximation to work well, you need the stability property of the filter, right? Because the stability property gives you a way of dissipating errors. So even though in each step you make an error in the approximation, over time you dissipate these errors, right? So then the approximation stays good over a long time, right? And the sad thing about deterministic dynamics, let's call this deterministic chaotic dynamics, deterministic chaotic dynamics, the filter can't be stable. Even if it's chaotic, and particularly if it's chaotic, it's impossible for the filter to be stable when you have no noise on your dynamics. And the reason is very easy to see, because you see, if I look at the law of xn in A given x0 and y1 to yn, right? If I know x0 and there is no noise, then I know my x always, right? So this is just, right? If it's deterministic, there's no noise. If I know where I started, I always know where I am, right? Now, if I don't know where I started, then of course I don't know where I am, but it could still be that as time goes to infinity, I'll gain more and more and more information, and eventually as time goes to infinity, I will still know where I am, right? That's possible. That will happen if the system is not chaotic, right? If the system is just, let's say it's just a limit cycle, right? It's something going around a cycle at a regular level, right? Then eventually, if I get more and more observations, I'll be able to pinpoint much more and more precisely where I am, right? But if the system is chaotic, you don't expect that to happen, right? So if the system is chaotic, this does not converge. Well, okay, this notation is a little bit silly, but you understand what I mean, right? Even if I let time go to infinity, because the system is chaotic, I will never gain so much information that I can pinpoint precisely where the system is.
Unless the observation coverage are perfect and coverage is
I mean, yes, if your observations are, but if my observations are perfect, I don't need to filter. I mean, but
why is right on the side of the jack.
yes, yeah. But I mean, it's not even clear. So I'll give you two problems. But one problem is it's not obvious when this is true and when this is not true, right? But at least intuitively, if you have a chaotic, so it's certainly always true that if I have a deterministic system, if I know where I am at the beginning, then I always know where I am, right? And it's intuitively true that if the system is chaotic, then if I don't know where I started, I will never be able to figure out where I am exactly, right? There will always be some lower bound on the error that I have at any given time. Because the system is chaotic, I can never gain so much information that I can converge to exactly the point where I am. Okay. If that were true, then data assimilation would be a very much easier task, right? So you see, the reason that you use a deterministic system, the filter will not be stable, period, right? It's not going to be stable, which means that you don't have a dissipation mechanism for the approximation errors, which means that over time the approximation errors are going to accumulate, and the filter is going to be, the approximation is going to behave worse and worse and worse and worse, and that's exactly what you see in practice, right? So you see it, right? Okay, so what's the solution? What is one solution? You just add some noise, right? The noise is not there, right? So one solution, right? Consider perturb xn, right? Make this whatever you want, let's say normal 0, 1, but I don't really care how you perturb it. I'm just giving you an example, right? So just add some noise, fictitious noise, right? So you don't think of this noise as being a model, right? This is fictitious noise I'm adding to make my algorithms work. So I add fictitious noise, right? And then design your whatever algorithm you're using, so for example, a particle filter, to approximate the filter for this perturbed model, right? But of course, you really are running it on the unperturbed model, right? But you're going to design your algorithm to run it on this perturbed model, right? So for example, if your particle filter, right? So for example, if you have a particle filter, right? So I'm going to run a particle filter with big N samples, right? But I'm going to run it designed based on this perturbed model, right? So I have two approximation parameters, epsilon and the number of particles, right? So if the number of particles goes to infinity, then this particle filter will converge not to the filter for the true model, but it will converge to the filter for the wrong model, right? And if I let epsilon go to 0, then it will converge to the particle filter for the true model, right? So is this clear, right? So, wait.
This is exactly what the sample cannon filter in this stochastic formulation works in practice.
Exactly. So, and people in data assimilation know this, right? So I'm interested in the theory, so there is no theory, right? But people in data assimilation know this, and I've seen it referred to as variance inflation.
That's another thing that maybe is connected to that.
Yes. So,
But this is exactly what he was mentioning.
yes.
When you say I should perturb the observation, is a way to say that the filter is formulated that is, the model was stochastic, but actually you evolved the model as it's computer deterministic.
Right.
You introduce this fictitious error.
Right. So this is what you should do, right? This is what we should do, right? So we agree that this is what we should do. Now the question is to understand it from a theoretical perspective, okay? So here is it's a very concrete problem, right? So how should we expect the error of this thing to behave, right? So if we look at the error, so pi n is the true filter for this model, right? At the end of the day, that's what we want to approximate. We don't want to approximate the filter for this. We want to approximate the filter for the true model, right? Even though it's not stable, right? So if we choose epsilon as 0, right, then this is going to have some error, which is like 1 over square root n, but you're going to have here some function of n, and Cn increases over time, right? It's not going to go to 0, right? But if you approximate, right, if you take pi and epsilon when epsilon is not 0, then you have two sources of error, right? Because when you have epsilon not 0, you have reduced this problem because now this model is stable, but now you have a bias. You've introduced a bias because you're using the wrong model, right? So you can view this as you have two sources of error. First, you have the error which comes from approximating using the particle filter, the filter for the wrong model, right? This is the bias. And then you have the error between, sorry, this is the variance. And then you have the error that you get by approximating the correct model without dynamical noise by the wrong model, right? So this is the bias, right? So the idea is that this guy is stable, right? The filter with the perturbation is stable, right? So this term should be of order 1 over square root n,
just times some constant. It's a constant that depends on epsilon, but not on time. Right? Right? This guy is stable, so we get an error that doesn't depend on time. But it blows up if I let epsilon go to 0. Right? But this term is some other, this bias, you see, this doesn't depend on the number of particles. The bias is another function of epsilon, but the bias decreases to 0 as epsilon goes to 0. Right? So if I make the model more and more correct, right, then the bias will go to 0, but the particle filter approximation will get worse and worse and worse. Right? So you have two terms, right? You have a term that is, right? You have the variance term and the bias term, right? So this suggests that what I should do is I should optimize this over epsilon. So the question is, how should I choose epsilon? How much noise should I add, right? And this gives you a very specific answer, right? So I should choose epsilon basically to minimize the sum of the bias and the variance. And if you were to do that, then you would get a consistent algorithm uniformly in time, right? So the idea is that, you see, the more particles I get, the more particles I take, the less noise I have to add to my system to make it work, right?
But this bias is not really a bias.
This is the bias in,
This is the bias of introduced and the difference between your model
and the fictitious model I'm using, right?
but your model has certain bias.
That's, I'm not talking about, I'm just talking about approximating this, assuming that this is the true model, yes. So this is the bias of the algorithm, not the bias of the model, right? So the question is very simple, right? So if we choose epsilon as a function of the number of samples in the particle filter, right? So the more samples I take in the particle filter, the less noise I have to add to get a good error, right? So the question is simple. Pick your favorite f, and I'm not suggesting you pick anything complicated. Pick a logistic model. Pick the simplest possible one-dimensional chaotic dynamical system you can imagine, right? And just study this problem and try to prove a theorem that says, well, if I pick epsilon as a function of the number of samples in a certain way, then actually my particle filter won't collapse. It will run well uniformly in time. The error will go to 0 uniformly in time as the number of particles go to infinity. Right? That's the problem. Right? Try to understand this in one example. Yes?
You know that the bias is dependent on that.
So that's another good question, right? It's not clear. So the problem is nobody understands filters themselves. We go back to the problem of filtering. We don't really understand filtering with a deterministic f, right? So, I mean, I'm posing this as a problem, but I don't know how to solve it. I don't know how to do this analysis. This analysis you can do, but I don't know how to do this analysis. And part of the reason is we don't understand how chaoticity affects the filter. I mean, there's another theoretical question here, which is much more basic, which is, I claimed that if the system is chaotic and I don't know the initial condition, I will never be able to pinpoint exactly where I am, right? This was a sort of intuition about interplay between chaos and observation noise. There is no theory about this, right? Now you could use this as a definition of a chaotic system, right? I could say a dynamical system is chaotic if when I observe it with additive noise, I don't add noise to the dynamics, right? You could define the deterministic system to be chaotic if when I observe it with additive noise, even as time goes to infinity, the error does not go to 0. I cannot estimate exactly where the thing is. Right? I could view this as a definition of chaos. But this is not how people study chaos. People study Lyapunov exponents. People,
This could be true also for non-chaotic systems.
I beg your pardon?
This could be also true for non-chaotic systems.
I think it's very unlikely to be true.
Wait, for example, if you don't satisfy the observability condition, then why would you expect
No, what I'm saying is the following.
more and more information?
No, but
So you can
I'm defined. Here, let's make this definition.
two uncoupled things, observe only one. You never come anywhere close to the second one at all.
No, but I mean, I'm talking about adding noise. It's observable, right? So definition, the map F is chaotic between quotes because that's not the usual definition. If I choose yn epsilon to be xn is f, yeah, exactly. No, I mean, plus epsilon cn, and these are normal 0, 1, right? Then the probability that xn is in A given y1 to yn minus the indicator AXN does not go to 0 and then goes to infinity. Right? I mean, I could take this as a definition, as a sensible definition of chaos. Right? This is chaos in the sense that if I observe it with error, I can never, it's too sensitive to the dynamics is too sensitive to be able to have my information accumulate over time to learn exactly where I am, right? But of course, I mean, if I allow myself a function here, that's a different matter, right? But this is not, I mean, this is intuition, right? But this is not the usual notion that people study chaos. People study chaos, they look at Lyapunov exponents, unstable direction, you know. So a completely different question is to try to see if you can understand this property, right?
Even if you add noise to the system,
To the system, which is, that's a different question, yeah.
then still I can have positive outcomes, right? I mean, I can have.
Oh, yeah.
Therefore, it's chaotic to begin with.
Yeah, but
Without your definition.
this is not the question here. Right? The question here is whether,
Without noise, it's chaotic and observation.
I mean, the question is whether you can tie this notion of chaos to more well-known notions. For example, let's say F only have positive Lyapunov exponents. Is this always true? I mean, I don't see any reason why it should be. I mean, these are sort of orthogonal ways of interpreting chaos, but, you know, finding conditions of the dynamical systems type which would guarantee probabilistic notion of chaos like this, nobody has studied these types of questions to my knowledge. I have one reference to those people who are interested. You have to come ask me, I look it up. But there's one reference that I know on this, but very, very abstract, nothing useful in practice. But, you know, so this would be a more basic question is, even to understand this notion, this property is not clear, right? But I don't know how to solve any of these problems, but I think, you know, this is a circle of ideas that's connected to data assimilation in a very, very different way than the issue of dimension, which nobody has studied theoretically. And it really comes into the heart of the system. You know, the heart of the problem is that nobody really understands how dynamical systems ideas, like chaos, interact with conditional distributions. It's a very different problem than the dimension problem, right? But there is no literature on this, and I think that's, you know, it might be a nice project for somebody to look at. I mean, you know, that's it. I've.
From a practical point of view,
Yes.
what you say, the practical way of implementing in practice,
Yes.
there are like two different schools.
Uh-huh.
On the one side is the one that essentially detects and maintain filter alive. All the arguments are much more heuristic and
Right.
practical, but it's exactly this.
Right.
So you maintain the filter alive by inflating the matrix, by adding noise.
Right.
So everything is more stable in this perspective. Then there is the other school, which is much more coming from concept of control theory in a way, in which you want to track the specific solution of that dynamical system, which is chaotic. And so the problem is the problem of having sufficient observation and sufficient frequency time in order to counteract the error growth that happens because of the chaoticity. And you want to kill this error growth sufficiently rapidly. So how people intervene on the matrix, instead of adding noise, it's inflate the matrix by just let it multiply and multiply. The reason to do so is because if our ensemble has been able to organize itself along the unstable mode of the system, I do not want to break this. So I want to keep the same rank and the same span of the matrix by just multiplying by coefficient. So these two schools are both competitive. There are a number of application and condition equation, one overcomes the others. But I mean, from the point of view of the application, I can tell you that there is not a single answer. I understand your claim from the point of view of the theory of the
No,
filtering.
I'm-
The question is,
I'm not saying this is the only answer. I'm saying this is one natural thing to do.
no, but it's great. I mean,
So the question, but we don't understand it.
it was just a comment about,
Yeah.
just a final comment about how filtering
Yeah,
in practice
yeah.
For example, Lawrence 96, effectively a very large scale system. So the fast dynamics in the territory, you can add noise to it, and that enters the slow modes as a noise, naturally. So in some problem, naturally there's some noise, but right, if you take a purely chaotic system without noise, you
but be careful about how you interpret theoretical results, because the best theoretical solution I can imagine for this problem is to say that, well, something like, well, epsilon should scale as, I'm just making it up, epsilon should scale as 1 over square root n, or 1 over log n, or 1 over n to the 2/3, but there will be a constant sitting in front. And in practice, if you actually wanted to use that as a practical guide, you would have to know what that constant is, and usually the constants that come out of the theory are terrible. So, this is really a theoretical problem. I'm not claiming that I can improve. In practice, you would still need to do trial and error to see, to see how much noise you should add. I'm not claiming that this is this will help necessarily in practice, but I think in order to understand the methods that people are using in practice, this is a very natural theoretical question that would require new mathematical methods. So, okay.
Okay, so
Yeah.
food for stomach after the food for thought.
So this is called quadratic optimization in very high dimensions. So of course this problem is not as difficult as high dimensional filtering, but still it has some challenges while implementing, trying to solve optimization problems in very high dimensions. So I will address the simplest class of problems, that is quadratic optimization. Okay, so just to have a quick recap, what is unconstrained quadratic optimization? It's that we want to minimize this function half x transpose px minus x transpose q plus some constant, where we assume that this matrix P, okay, is a square matrix of size n cross n. We assume that it is symmetric and positive definite. So we assume the simplest possible case, okay, and one can check that the optimal point is given by this x opt equal to P inverse q, and f of x opt equal to is given by this form. Okay, so although we have some neat closed form expressions in high dimensions, the fact that we have this inverse over here, that is the cause for concern. Okay, so let's have a quick recap of how we would have traditionally tried to solve this. I'm sure everyone knows all these things. So your methods could have either been direct or iterative. So in direct schemes, you would have used something like SVD or Cholesky decomposition to factorize the matrix. Okay, but the problem with this is, if you actually try to run a serial version of this, just to store the matrix P. Okay, so matrix P has n square entries, so you need a memory of size order n square. And if you actually try to run these algorithms, you will have an order n cube running time. So when n is really large, what this says is you have to wait for a really long time before you get the solution. Okay, so that's something that we want to avoid. And if you actually look up literature, you will have parallel schemes, but you will require polynomial in n processes. Again, when n is large, okay, this is again, so you want like really large number of processes, that's what this says. So the other option is going for an iterative scheme. So some popular schemes, okay, that have been classical schemes is the steepest descent, conjugate gradient, etc. Okay, but these are called the gradient based iterative schemes. The gradient for the quadratic function is given by this. What I want you to observe is there is a matrix vector multiplication. Okay, and here also what I want to observe is there is a matrix vector multiplication. Okay, so because of this, even in trying to just compute the function value or trying to compute the gradient, okay, involves a matrix vector multiplication, okay, which has a order n square running time. Okay, so this in very high dimensions is the problem. Okay, this order n square running time and the order n square memory requirement. Okay, so let's see how bad. Okay, so let's see what happens when n is roughly 2 to the power 20. Okay, that is the reason for choosing 2 to the power 20 is because this is roughly equal to 1 million. Okay, so if you actually see this, and if you choose 64 bits, that is double precision per entry for the P matrix, just to store P matrix, I'm not doing anything. Just to store P matrix, I will require 8 terabytes of memory, okay, just to store the P matrix. So one can see that, forget about main memory and all, your hard disk itself, you will see that you will, wanting a really large hard disk. So how do we actually go about doing this? And if I actually have some, let's say some assumption that you use some 1 nanosecond for some addition or multiplication, okay, then one can just have a rough back of the paper calculation. You will get that at least each iteration will take 15 minutes. But this ignores the fact that your main memory is small, so you will have to do multiple fetching from the secondary memory and all those things. So because of that, this number going into hours, days is not unimaginable. Okay, so these are the kind of challenges we will have. And when you try to actually do parallelization, you might require something close to 1 million processors and things like that. Okay, so the question is sophisticated computational model which has like lot of main memory, lot of secondary storage, is it required? Okay, that is the question we want to ask. Okay, so when I say computational paradigm, I will assume that when you try to implement serial, you have something like this. Okay, and I say this is enough in the sense that you have a processor, you have a main memory, so there is a budget on the size of main memory. Okay, but what I'll assume is the secondary storage has some distributed nature. So you want to store 8 terabytes, so I'll assume that your hard disk is large enough and there is a distributed nature that is given. So I'm saying this is enough to solve the problem. Okay, you don't actually require a really large main memory. Okay, so let's just go about seeing this, what I want to do. So the problem statement is this: we want to build an efficient iterative scheme for unconstrained quadratic programming in very high dimensions. So when I say very high dimensions, I'll assume that n is roughly 1,000,000 or more. Okay, so that's the kind of problems that I want to tackle. So let's just understand, when I say efficient, what do I really want? So observe that if you want to store the entire P and Q, okay, so forget Q for the time being, just to store the entire P you require 8 terabytes. Okay, so you cannot build an algorithm which in each iteration tries to use the whole of P. Yes? Yeah, P is symmetric. So you might, you will only require to store half the entries, but still the order will not change. Okay, so you are right. Okay, so we want to come up with algorithms that don't require whole of P in each iteration. Okay, so can we try to do something on those lines? But in spite of not wanting to use whole of P and Q, we do not want the algorithms to converge really slowly. Okay, so we want small convergence rate. So small convergence rate means faster convergence. Okay, and the last is ability to trade. The third point is ability to trade off 1 with 2. So tomorrow, suppose you have access to more main memory, you should be able to speed up your algorithm. Okay, but let's say after a couple of days you are running short of main memory, you should be able to reduce your main memory requirements and still be able to run the algorithm. So that's what we are trying to do. Okay, and there are some other points. So another point that is required to keep in mind is we should be able to do controlled parallelization. By controlled parallelization, I mean that suppose you have 100 processes, can I achieve some speed up? It's not always that I need million processes. That's not the kind of thing that we want. And the last is that we want the algorithms to actually respect a distributed storage of program data. So you can see that since we have 8 terabytes, you cannot store it at all at one place. So it will be necessary to actually store it at different locations. So we want algorithms that actually respect this distributed storage. Okay, and in spite of all this, the total running time. Okay, so total running time is the running time per iteration and the number of iterations. We don't want this to be very different from what traditional schemes are. Okay, what traditional schemes take. Okay, like this conjugate gradient or steepest descent. So if you run this algorithm, they will. So I will come to all these order calculations. So what you are saying is right. It's roughly order n square kappa and things like that. So I will come to all those things. Okay. So what is the alternative approach? Okay. So the first thing is the per iteration running time is very large if you try to directly do it. And the second thing is trying to use algorithms which use whole of P and Q in each iteration. That itself is a problem. Okay. So we want to come up with algorithms which don't require whole of P in each iteration. Okay, that is the first thing. And secondly, we want algorithms whose per iteration running time is not very large. Okay, so the idea is if you try to restrict a convex function to an affine space, it's still a lower dimensional convex function. Okay, so solving this lower dimensional convex function, we believe perhaps might be a quicker way to solve or go from one estimate to the next estimate. Okay, so that's the idea. So keeping this estimate in mind, so let me just describe quickly the rough idea of what we are trying to do. So we will assume that we know this initial approximation to the optimal point and we will fix some number d, okay, between 1 and n. Okay. Now let's say you ran this algorithm and somehow reached xk. So I'll tell you how to go to xk plus 1. Okay. So the idea is consider all d-dimensional affine spaces that pass through xk. So the key thing is passing through xk. Suppose you keep that in mind. Now you pick one of these affine spaces. So how to pick? One will need to discuss, but let's say you pick one of them using some strategy. Okay, so the next iterate is given in this fashion. The next iterate is xk plus 1 is the minimum of f of x restricted to ak. Okay, so ak I will call as one of the chosen affine spaces in iteration k, and I will set the next estimate to the minimum of f only restricted to this affine space. So the idea is that when I restrict f to this affine space, it's a lower dimensional problem. And hopefully going from xk to xk plus 1 will now be easier, and hopefully I will not be requiring whole of p and q in each iteration. That's the hope. Okay, so I hope the goal is clear what I'm trying to do. So I have these collection of affine spaces, d-dimensional affine spaces. I say affine because xk need not be the origin. Okay, so you consider the affine spaces, d-dimensional affine spaces passing through xk. Pick one of them. How you pick, I'll discuss later. Okay, so pick one of them. That affine space I'll call as ak. Okay, so no, I'll discuss those things. So those things I will discuss. I have not yet discussed it. Yeah.
T is 1, and then the other equation will be
Line, a line passing through xk. Yeah. So it will depend on which direction you choose. If you choose the gradient, then it is the gradient descent. Otherwise, it's not. So now I am not restricting myself that you should choose the gradient. I mean, do you get it? That's the difference. I am not restricting myself that you pick this direction specifically. If you say I want to move in this direction, that is given by the gradient itself, then it's the gradient descent. But I am not allowing I am not saying you should pick that, because if you want to compute the gradient, there itself you have a problem. Do you get it? Computing the gradient itself has a matrix vector multiplication. So you want to come up with algorithms that don't try to explicitly compute the gradient. Okay, so that's the idea. Because computing the gradient itself is a problem. Okay, I hope that is clear, because it has a matrix vector multiplication. Okay, so a quick comment on how would you actually generate AK. So the key thing to note is that it's a d-dimensional affine space, and we want this xk to lie in AK. So I will highlight why we want this condition. So the way we do it is we generate some matrix mk of size n cross d. Okay, so how do you generate this? Whether we want to use a randomized approach or whether you want to use some deterministic approach, that I will come later, but somehow you generate this matrix mk and you set ak to be xk plus the column space of nk. So that's how I'll generate this affine space. Okay, so the key thing to note, so why did I want this xk to lie in ak? So the idea is, since xk lies in ak, f of xk plus 1 will be less than equal to f of xk. Is this clear? So that is, we have a guaranteed descent. And for quadratic programs, if you actually define this sort of a norm, then the relation between f of x and this norm has this straightforward relation. Okay, so measuring how f descends, one can equivalently use the distance of x from x op in this p norm. Okay, so one can measure how the convergence rate is, and that's what we will stick to. So I have not discussed that. I will be discussing that. All I am saying is you need to generate mk. So the first question was we wanted to generate ak. How do I generate ak? Is by generating mk. Now I will tell how to generate mk. Is this okay? Okay. I mean, we will come to that. That's the part of my next slide. Okay, because I will address those issues. Okay, so
Can you go back previous slide? I mean, the last line, how do you guarantee that?
one can just check it. I mean, you just. Okay. I mean, I will. We can discuss this later. Okay, that's not really important. Okay, so let's just forget this. All it.
The last is true even when f is not quadratic.
No, you will have an inequality then in general. Okay, so this is equal. Yeah, only for quadratic you have a equality. Okay. Yeah. So let's forget about the iterations. Let's focus. Yes. It's strongly something like strongly convex. Yeah. Okay. So let's focus on this update rule. So what I'll do is I'll forget all iterations. Let's just focus on one iteration. Okay. So I will call x bar to be the current estimate and x bar plus to be the new estimate. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll generate some matrix M. So let's ignore the subscripts and all. I'll generate a matrix M and minimize F restricted to the affine space A, which is given by x plus column space of M. Okay. So believe me that this will be the update rule that you will get. Okay. So now based on this, we want to come up with how to generate M. That's the idea. Okay. So let's quickly go through this. Okay. So the key observations is that there is a, okay, M is an n cross D matrix. So this M transpose PM will be a D cross D matrix. Okay. And there is an inverse involved. So you want to choose M so that this guy is invertible, so that it is well defined. Okay. So to ensure that, one can quickly check that this is invertible if and only if the rank of M is D. Okay. So that is a very easy calculation to do. The next thing to check, and this is one of the important observations, is that to go from x bar to x bar plus, so given the current estimate to go to the new estimate, observe that we don't need P and Q as such. What we instead need are the transformations M transpose P and M transpose Q. Okay. So it's okay if I don't know P. It's okay if I don't know Q. But what I need to know is M transpose P and M transpose Q. But the problem is, even if one row of M is dense, okay, then multiplying a row of M with P matrix is again order of n square. Is this okay? So I cannot have M in which even a single row is dense. I hope this fact is clear. Okay. Because of this reason, how do I choose M? So there are two constraints. One is that rank of M must be small, and I don't want that the per iteration cost to be of order n square. I want it to be sub-quadratic. I want it to be as close to linear as possible. So how do I choose m? That's the question. Okay. So the thing that is natural is that m should be sparse. Okay. We want it as sparse as possible, because even if a single row is dense, you will go into order n square computation. Okay. So how do we do that? So the most basic way, okay, is to choose the columns of m. So we need to choose d columns of m. So how would I go about doing it? I will, let's say these are the standard basis vectors of Rn, okay. I will pick d of them in a uniformly random fashion without replacement. So the idea of without replacement is I want full column rank, okay. And you can observe that in this setting, m will be the sparsest possible which has column rank d. Okay, so let's see what are the advantages and disadvantages of this. Okay, so observe that we have this m transpose p. Okay, if ei is the ith standard basis vector, then ei transpose p picks the ith row of p. Okay, so m transpose p, when this is d of these vectors, will pick d rows of p. Is this okay? So in each iteration, I don't need whole of p. What I need is just d uniformly random rows of p. So that's why the first thing is, in each iteration I only need a d over n fraction of the total data. Okay, so that's the first advantage that we observe from this. Okay, then in each iteration, if you actually check this, so m transpose p, okay, so this is a d cross n matrix, to multiply it with x bar, okay, that will give us a running time of order nd. So from order n square we have brought it down to order nd, and d is a parameter that is available to us. So we can play around with this parameter d and ensure what is the running time. Okay, but what is the problem with this algorithm? The problem is, what would you ideally like to do? You will want to store the p across distributed hard disks, right? So what this algorithm says is you need to pick d rows in a uniformly random fashion. So it may so happen that some rows lie in one hard disk, the other rows lie in that hard disk. So this is actually going to add a lot of time. What you would like to do is the following. Okay, we would like to partition the p matrix in such way. Okay, and what we would like to do is, in one iteration I will only deal with rows that lie in this partition or rows in this partition. Okay, so that's what we will call as a random block coordinate descent. So the first one was called random block coordinate descent. The second one is again random block coordinate descent, but with prefix blocks. Okay, so how to partition this, that is a question, but we will answer that later. But suppose you decide on some partition rule, okay, and now what you want to do is, let's say in is the identity matrix of n cross n, you partition it in this way, okay, where each sub matrix is of dimensions n cross d. Okay, so ui transpose p, so I set m equal to 1 of ui, where I is chosen in a random fashion or some according to some rule. Okay, so ui or m transpose p, which is equivalent to ui transpose p, will be equivalent to picking the ith block. Okay, so this algorithm respects the distributed storage. That's what I want to say. Okay, how to order the rows of p, that is a question that I have still not answered. But suppose you come up with a good way of ordering the p, then you partition it this way. This is a good algorithm because it respects the distributed storage of data. Okay, so the next question we would like to ask is,
Yeah, the issue of the ordering of the P is more for convergence, fast convergence.
come again?
This issue about the
Order of, yes, it's about convergence. How fast will we converge? So we are handling we are handling different issues at different steps. Okay, so here we wanted a distributed storage, so this is what we would like to do. Now how would you arrange the rows of P will actually come when we try to answer when we want to have the best convergence rate possible with this kind of algorithm. So what we could do is we could pick one of the blocks in a random fashion. Okay, so the next question is, can we do better than having this random fashion? So perhaps we can come up with some weights that are associated with each block. Okay, so these weights are static in nature. So you decide some weights with each blocks, and then you pick these blocks in probability that is proportional to something that depends on these blocks. Okay, but can we do something better than that? So the question now boils down to coming up with a greedy block coordinate descent. Okay, so you have some prefix blocks. Now in each iteration, can I decide which is the best block to move forward? Okay, so if you actually look at the distance of the new estimate from xopt in this norm with regards to the distance of the old estimate from xopt in this norm, then you actually have this relation. Okay, so let me quickly tell you what are the terms here. So you have this del j f of x bar. Okay, so this is the jth block of the gradient. Okay, so you have this block, you partition into d blocks. okay, and pick the jth block. Okay, so one way to look at this is you just do uj transpose del of x bar, where this is the gradient at x bar. Okay, this pjj inverse, so you have this matrix P, so these are your diagonal blocks. Okay, so pjj will refer to the diagonal block in the jth block. Okay, the jth diagonal block in the jth block in the jth partition. Okay, so that is what this will refer to, and then you have this. Okay, so can we come up with this sort of a rule? I will choose that I which maximizes this. Okay, because we are trying to minimize the error, can we come up with this rule which says that I'll pick that block for which this is the minimum. Okay, the problem with this thing is that you have a gradient that is present over here. Can you see that? Okay, so if I recall, I mentioned at the beginning that computing the gradient is a problem because you have a matrix vector multiplication, right? But I will say this is not a problem in coordinate descent as such, especially when you deal with quadratic optimization, because in coordinate descent, what does this mean? It means that only d coordinates are changing in each iteration. So because of this fact and the fact that the matrix P is symmetric, okay, one can compute the gradient at the new estimate as a function of the old estimate plus something. Okay, and I am claiming, okay, that this operation is again order nd and not order n square. Okay, this is very easy to check. Okay, this uses the fact that we are only descending in few coordinates. Okay, so if you chose the ith block, then x bar plus and x bar only differs in this block of coordinates. Rest of the coordinates are not different. Is this okay? Because of this reason, what I am trying to claim is that computing the new gradient as a function of this is only effort order nd. Because of this, we can actually use such a rule. Okay, a greedy block coordinate descent.
But the number of blocks is going to be order n. Because m if
Yeah. Yeah, so what you are saying is right. So computing this expression, okay, so assume that this P. So there are n over d blocks. That's the right thing. Yeah, so what I am saying is suppose you compute this pjj block, the inverse of these blocks. So these are d cross d blocks, okay, and you will be reusing them again and again. Okay, so assume that you pre-compute them, okay, then multiplying this expression is order d square. If you have already pre-computed the inverse, computing this is order d square, and you have n over d blocks. So n over d times order d square again boils down to order nd. That's what I am saying. What you are saying is a right question. Oh, we have so many blocks, so computing this for each block might be expensive, but I am saying it's not. If we pre-compute these things, is this okay? Okay. So now what I want to say is, what does the performance analysis of this greedy block coordinate descent boils down to? Okay, so the per iteration gain or the improvement in per iteration can actually be written in this form. Okay, so after some trivial algebraic manipulations, you can write it in this form. Okay, so the key thing that I want you to observe is this expression has this gradient at x bar b inverse gradient of x bar, where b is the diagonal block of P. Okay, so you have some block structure. Okay, so let's say this is your P matrix. So whatever is not on the block diagonal, just put it to 0. That will be your B matrix. Okay, this is how you get your B matrix, and this is the expression that you have. So what this relation says is, if your P matrix is block diagonal, okay, then this relation is 1. Okay, then the gradient, I mean the convergence rate that we come up with, this is independent of the eigenvalues of P, if it was block diagonal. Okay, if it is not block diagonal, then how close is P inverse to B inverse? Okay, so that is the kind of relation that we are working on presently. If you can find that relation, we will be able to show that this will be still significantly better. Yeah. Okay, so based on this, we can come up with some convergence rate. Since I am short of time, let me not discuss this and go to the simulation results. Okay, so this is the convergence in norm P. Okay, so this is the convergence in the function value. Okay, I want you to be careful because I will be talking convergence in function value and convergence in the estimate of the optimal point. Okay, so that will be convergence in Euclidean norm, and here I am talking about convergence in P norm. Okay, so let's see what are the conclusions. So this two things, that is the blue one and the green one that you can see. The green one is the one that is given by conjugate gradient, and the blue one is the steepest descent. Okay, so on the y-axis you have the error, and on the x-axis you have the iteration count. Okay, so right now I am only worried about iterations, so that which discusses the convergence rate. Okay, and this golden one is the greedy block coordinate descent. Okay, and this algorithm is the random block coordinate descent that I discussed, and this purple one is choosing this according to some static weighing rule, these red and these purple ones. Okay, so you can see that the random choosing this is not really good. Okay, it does not actually help us in minimizing the function value quickly. Conjugate gradient and steepest descent converge really quickly. Okay, but observe that steepest descent after some time actually stagnates. Okay, and that is the traditional problem that is associated with steepest descent, and this is our algorithm. Okay, so our algorithm, by doing block coordinate descent, the number of iterations required is less as compared to steepest descent. But the thing to note is the running time of each iteration is still very less. Okay. Now here I will be talking about convergence in L2 norm. Okay, so here it's actually a very different picture. So the picture is here, you can observe that many algorithms you may feel they are performing actually good. Okay, but here if you actually observe, most of these algorithms, so they are these algorithms that you can notice, most of them are which are coordinate descent, actually do not converge to xopt in L2 norm. Okay, so these algorithms are really good if you are only interested in estimating the function value, but if you are actually interested in estimating the xopt, okay, then you can observe that these algorithms don't really go really close to xopt. Okay, but on the other hand, our algorithms, remember the guaranteed descent that I mentioned was in P norm. Okay, but here I am talking about L2 norm. So we don't have a guaranteed descent, that is a monotonic descent, but still after a few iterations it starts descending. Is this okay? And this is the random block thing. So in fact what happened was the estimate that you eventually came up with was really far away in L2 norm from xopt. Okay, so thank you.